Dirty Politics, Hard Times, a Trilogy of Chartism by Malc Cowle, narrated by the author. Book 3, Daniel Akroyd's Revenge. Poverty and death. How little can the rich man know of what the poor man feels, when want, like some dark demon foe, nearer and nearer steals. He never tramped the weary round, a stroke of work to gain, and sickened at the dreaded sound, which tells he seeks in vain. Footsore, heartsore, he never came back through the winter's wind, to a dank cellar, there no flame, no light, no food to find. He never saw his darlings lie, shivering, the flags their bed. He never heard that maddening cry, "Daddy, a bit of bread?" Manchester Song, from Mary Barton, by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 1. Happy birthday, Daniel. Thanks, Dad. Come on, sit this hell down, lad. There's tea in the pot. Sup that, and we'll be off to Hardwick Green. Auntie Rose will be looking out for you. Young Daniel looked across the table at his father and smiled. He'd just reached 14. It was a bright Sunday morning in early August 1851, and a major stepping stone in his young life. He'd be starting work the next day as an apprentice with William and Colin Mather and Company, engineers, machine makers, millwrights and iron founders, at the Salford Iron Works in Garden Lane. "Why does Auntie Rose want to see me?" "'Cause it's your birthday, you daft apeth." Daniel Akroyd looked at his son, pleased with what he saw. The lad stood 5'4" tall, slim and wiry, not unlike himself. He had long dark hair and his mother's dark brown eyes, surrounded by long, almost feminine lashes, with dark, thick eyebrows above. His cheekbones were high, his nose straight. Whenever he smiled, and he was prone to smiling a lot, being a good-natured lad, 2 dimples formed beneath his cheeks. Blessed with a good sense of humour, when necessary the lad could wield it like a weapon, that sharp it cut like a razor drawing blood before the recipient barely noticed it had been brought into play. Daniel was very much his mother's son, and many of Bess Akroyd's attributes lived on in him. Despite her murder when he was only 16 months old, Bess's values, her aims and hopes for a better future, and her determination to see them realised, had been carefully tended and nurtured in the youngster by his beloved Aunt Rose. Daniel's only serious weakness lay in a deviant need that had taken a grip on his mind a long time previously, that long ago he couldn't remember exactly when, saving he was very young when he had made his decision. Since then he'd nursed it at times, thought about it intermittently, and worked out the fine details of its execution. It wasn't something he dwelt on a lot, not anymore anyway. He'd reached the point long before where he could almost see it happening in front of his eyes whenever he willed it. It was just something he knew had to happen. He hadn't discussed his decision or intended purpose with anyone, not even his Aunt Rose. He knew it would be counterproductive to do so, and he'd be misunderstood if he did. It had to remain his secret until it was completed. Then it wouldn't matter one way or the other. Nathaniel West, Esquire, the mill manager who had murdered his mother, would receive his just deserts. Justice would be done and his mother avenged. To cut a long story short, Daniel simply intended to kill the miscreant.
"Constance?" "Yes, Mother?" The youngster looked away from the library window and turned to the woman she relied on, and whom she'd called Mother for as long as she could remember. The mill owner's daughter put down her embroidery. "You wear the glass out staring through the window like that? They'll be here soon enough." The 12-year-old frowned. "I'm sure I do not know what you are talking about." "Of course you don't, Constance dear, any more than you realise you're blushing." Irene Rose smiled at the youngster's discomfort. "Cousin Daniel will be here soon. Now why don't you make yourself busy? I'd love some tea." "You really are impossible sometimes, Mother. As if I would be worried about such a common boy as Daniel Akroyd. I have more important things on my mind, I can assure you." "None the less, Constance, my love, I think you'll find if you make some tea, time will pass, and before you know it, you'll be enjoying the company of the common boy, as you call Daniel, and I'm sure in the meantime you will no doubt rediscover your manners." Constance shook her long dark locks in mock indifference, but walked towards the library door, deciding it was better to comply with Irene Rose's wishes than argue. As she opened the door, Michael O'Donnell entered. "I've just a present for young Daniel. What do you think, Rose?" "What is it, father?" Constance asked, before he had chance to approach his wife, a carefully composed indifference suddenly giving way to curiosity. Michael had a small leather-covered box in his hand. "Open it carefully, Ursula," he said softly, passing the box over. The girl lifted the hinged lid and looked at the shiny instrument in wonder. She'd never seen anything quite like it. "What is it, father?" she repeated. "It's a micrometer. It measures metal bars to the accuracy of 10,000ths of an inch. Why on earth would anybody want such a thing?" Michael shook his head. "Constance, my love, Daniel is setting out to be an engineer. This'll be an essential part of his equipment." "How common," she responded as she left the room. Michael, somewhat taken aback, looked at Rose. "Why is Constance acting so peculiarly?" "I wouldn't worry about it, Michael. I think she has a crush on Daniel, and she doesn't want to admit it." "A crush? They've always behaved like brother and sister." Irene Rose laughed. "But they're not brother and sister, are they? Daniel's a rather handsome young man, and Constance is at an age where she's seeing him in a new light. She just doesn't want to admit it. She'll be 13 next May. She's growing into a young woman fast." The whole idea seemed completely new to the Irishman. "What does Daniel think?" "I doubt if he's aware of it. I'm sure nobody will have consulted him about the situation, and I'm sure his mind will be consumed by the prospect of starting employment tomorrow." She gazed at her husband for a moment, a twinkle in her bright blue eyes. "Mind you, I think we could be in for an interesting day. I'm looking forward to seeing exactly how Constance deals with the situation and how Daniel reacts." "Let's have a look at this, son." Daniel made a move to straighten his lad's tie. "Stop mithering thyself, either. Aunt Rose will no worry if me collar's no quick reap." Daniel Senior chuckled. "I just want you to look your best, lad." He led the way up the short flight of steps to the Hedgerow's front door and rapped on the Lion's Head knocker. Within moments they heard the sound of feet on the entrance hall floor. The door opened and Grace the maid smiled a welcome. "Happy birthday, Daniel. Many happy returns. Good morning, Mr. Akroyd. Come in. Miss Rose is in the library." She ushered them along the passage, knocked briefly on the first door on the left, and opened it. "Mr. Akroyd and Daniel," she announced, standing back to allow them to enter the library. Michael O'Donnell stood with his back to the fire, nodding his head and smiling a greeting. Constance stood at her station by the window, although she now had her back to it, the object of her questing eyes having arrived in the room. Irene Rose sat in her favourite armchair, to one side of the black marble fireplace. She stood up, balancing her embroidery on the arm of the chair as she did so. "Happy birthday, Daniel," she greeted the lad. Daniel smiled and walked over to her as his father joined Michael. He placed his hands on her shoulders and kissed her on the cheek affectionately. "Thank you, Aunt Rose. Are you well?" "Yes, of course." She grinned at him. "My, you look handsome in your new jacket. Just let me—" He laughed as she straightened his tie. "There," she said. "Just perfect. Don't you think, Constance?" "You look very nice, Daniel," Constance said quietly, suddenly seeming shy, an unusual situation, the young lass normally being the life and soul of the party. "Aren't you going to give Daniel his card?" Irene Rose asked, a mock frown creasing her forehead. The youngster smiled a smile that illuminated her pretty face, as if the sun had appeared from behind a cloud. She brought her right hand from behind her back to reveal an envelope. "Happy birthday," she said quietly, as she walked across the room, her hand held out towards him. He returned her smile and accepted the card. "Thank you, Constance." She gazed into his dark brown eyes as he took the envelope from her hand, wondering how he'd react to the carefully worded message she'd inscribed on the card she'd taken such trouble to make for him. They'd been friends and playfellows from the day she'd first come to live in the Hedgerow household 9 years previously. Daniel was 21 months older, but it had never seemed significant. They seemed to have grown up together, and as far as Constance had been concerned, Daniel was just a boy who was amusing and good company. Slowly over the past year, fondness had changed to admiration, and then to something approaching love. Daniel was no longer just a friend in Constance's eyes. He was an object of desire, who, despite her pretence and her earlier dismissal of him as being common, she dearly wished to pay her more attention, instead of always taking her for granted in a brotherly way, as he seemed to do, and as he was doing now. Daniel returned her gaze for a moment and smiled. "I'll open it later, Connie," he said, placing it in his pocket. He turned his attention back to Irene Rose without so much as giving the girl a friendly peck on the cheek, failing to see the shadow of disappointment crossing briefly over his young friend's face. Poor Constance was understandably upset at his apparent indifference. "Where are Bess, Faith and Benji?" he asked. "Matthew's taken them out in a pony and trap," Michael responded. "We'll be meeting them at Mary's kitchen later." "I need to be getting ready," Irene Rose said. She glanced at the old grandfather clock in the corner of the room. "We mustn't be too late at Mary's. Why don't you two youngsters go out into the garden? Don't waste the sunshine." She turned to Daniel's father. "Would you like some tea, Daniel? I'll ask Grace to bring some." She smiled to herself as Constance seized her opportunity, taking young Daniel by the arm and gently guiding him out of the room before he had a chance to realise what was happening. "That's more like it," Irene Rose thought to herself. "A woman has to be assertive to get anywhere in this male-orientated world, Constance, my love." Matthew Heathrow sat on the bank of the River Medlock in Daisy Nook, feeling as happy as a sandboy and a lot younger than his actual age. It had been many months since he'd visited this rural spot, which had somehow managed to escape the ravages of the Industrial Revolution. His grandchildren, by adoption in the case of Faith and Benjamin, and by birth in the case of the youngest, Bess, now 8 years of age, were all off exploring, although not too far away to escape his attention. Occasionally, one or the other, and sometimes all three at once, would draw to his notice some small insect, aquatic animal, or unusual plant they'd discovered. His mind kept wandering back to the past, when he wasn't so much older than his grandchildren were now, and his father had brought him to this very spot. In those days, it comprised a tiny part of the rural landscape that predominated in this part of Lancashire before the exponential growth of the cotton industry and the equally accelerating expansion of the urban environment it brought about, attracting ever more labour to meet its voracious appetite. Daisy Nook now found itself surrounded by the textile townships of Clayton, Failsworth, Oldham, Athershaw, Waterloo, Ashton-under-Lyne and Droylsden, which were but small villages at most when Matthew was a child. Because of its geological peculiarities, as a small steep-sided twisted valley through which the Medlock meandered like a liquid serpent, situated on the edge of the Pennines on the one hand and as part of the Lancashire Plain on the other, it had managed to escape being built on to any large extent, builders always looking for an easy option and preferring level ground. The Nook boasted a tiny hamlet, a couple of farmhouses and a public house. As such, it was a magnet for young lovers, family parties and individuals of all classes who merely wanted to snatch a few hours' escape from urban squalor into a cleaner, simpler and more attractive environment. Wage slave and master alike could linger here by the river, delight in the scent of hawthorn blossom in spring, and be uplifted by the sight of yellow catkins on the pussy willows dancing in the breeze. Here they could picnic amongst daisies, buttercups and clover in the fields on warm summer days, dawdle along the riverbank and collect blackberries, sloes and wild strawberries from the hedgerows in their seasons. Sometimes, by accident, men and women, boys and girls, from the two great classes in society, not only met, but found themselves communicating together, each feeling equal to the other as they jointly commune with nature. Some instinctively realised they were not merely just a part of the natural world, but actually belonged to the same animal species, and perhaps shared common attributes. A peculiar thing, since in their everyday lives they had so little in common, they might as well have populated completely different planets. On this particular day, Matthew Etherow, mill owner and man of means, had determined to enjoy the simpler pleasures of life and reminisce about days gone by, as a man of his age had every right to do. Daisy Newton not only held out memories dating back to his early childhood. This was the place, decades before, where he'd first met and subsequently courted the girl who was to become his wife and the mother of his beloved daughter, Irene Rose. If times were tense, and he'd been silly enough to allow himself to have a fallout with his spouse, this is where he'd always brought her, as a prelude to apologising and making up. In short, for Matthew it was a special place, a magical healing place, a place to remember his long-dead lover, but also to enjoy the young family he now found himself blessed with, to contemplate and weigh up the past, and to attempt to look forward to and plan for the future, whatever it might hold. Suddenly, a small, soft, warm pair of arms snaked around his neck, and a distinctive voice whispered in his ear, "Shouldn't us be getting back, grandfather? I don't wish to mither you, but Daniel will be expecting us surely." Young Bess, Irene Rose's natural daughter, another admirer of young Daniel Akroyd, and the one member of the O'Donnell family studying Broad Lancashire as a second language, rudely interrupted Matthew's thoughts, bringing him back to reality. "Happy birthday, Daniel. I wasn't certain you'd be here." Emma Chadwick looked at the lad who had been her closest companion and friend, and often her staunchest defender at Mary Upton's nursery, from ever since she could remember, a mischievous smile lighting up her face. Daniel laughed. "Well, as you can see, Emma, I'm here, and all the better for seeing you." "Well, Daniel Akroyd," she responded with a grin, "I haven't a present with me, and I haven't made thee a card, 'cause I weren't expecting you, so I guess you'll just have to make do with this." With that, she put her hands either side of his face, pulled him towards her gently by the ears, and kissed him, full on the lips, completely devoid of any trace of shame or embarrassment, much to Irene Rose's amusement, young Bess's and little Faith's delight, and Daniel Senior's surprise. Constance, on the other hand, perhaps because she was more sensitive to the current mores and sensitivities of Victorian society, or simply because she was in love, viewed the whole episode with dismay. Daniel blushed slightly and then laughed, giving Emma a hug, before breaking away to look into her clear grey eyes, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. "That's a good enough present for 1 year, Emma Chadwick," he responded, "though I don't know what your mother would say if she saw you kissing me like that, you lyle goose." He gazed into her eyes for a brief moment, somewhat shyly, before making his mind up and kissing her on the lips affectionately in his turn. If a kiss was his birthday present, he might as well make the most of it. One of Daniel's very first memories involved Emma kissing him on a glorious summer's day, as summer days always seemed to be when one was young. They'd been playing together, running about, chasing each other in Mary Upton's yard, when little more than toddlers. Daniel had tripped and fallen. As a result, he'd grazed his right knee on the stone cobbles. The incident had upset Emma, who thought it her fault, but Daniel had assured her she wasn't to blame. They'd sat on a curb together, and, sensing she needed reassurance, he put his arm around her as young friends do. Emma responded by kissing him softly on the cheek. Since then, the bond between them had strengthened. The two children had enjoyed many adventures together. They'd explored the banks of the Rochdale Canal, sneaking off when they perhaps shouldn't have, causing all kinds of worry to the adults in whose charge they'd been committed. They delighted in playing tricks on others, both children and adults, and were generally known as a source of mischief and good-natured fun. They'd explored their immediate part of the world together, and during the process had developed a profound respect for and confidence in each other. Over the years they'd become virtually inseparable. They'd soon grown to love each other, as they still did. However, it must be stressed this was the deep, rather profound kind of love enjoyed by two close friends, who happened to be members of the opposite sex. It wasn't your common or garden lustful kind of sexual love, but an unspoken commitment of friendship and loyalty, the kind of trusting love that would last a lifetime. Nonetheless, little Faith wasn't to know the difference. She tugged on Constance's sleeve to draw big sister's attention to what she saw as a romantic drama unfolding before her eyes. Constance didn't welcome having the situation drawn to her attention. Having witnessed it with her own eyes, she was not amused. "Why does he have to speak and behave in such a common way?" she responded sharply. "He knows how to speak properly. He doesn't talk like that to Mother." Bess laughed. She might have been the youngest of the O'Donnell family, but she recognised the sin of envy when she heard it. "Maybe if you learnt Lancashire, Daniel'd take more notice of you, and you'd stop being mithered by th' idea of him being with t'other lass," she pointed out, exaggerating her own grasp of the local dialect, and demonstrating her knowledge of Constance's emotions and feelings towards Daniel deliberately, knowing it would annoy. Much to Irene Rose's amusement, Constance rose to the bait and rounded on her. "You're just as bad, Bess. You should know better, having been brought up in a decent household." Her youngest sister retaliated with another laugh. "Broad Lancashire's the language of the poets," Bess asserted. She grinned, delighting in her sister's discomfort, although it remained a mystery where she dreamt up that particular idea. Nobody asked, all instinctively knowing young Bess would be in no hurry to provide enlightenment as to the source of her knowledge. Irene Rose didn't know where her daughter had picked the idea up from either, but she did approve of her general advice. "I think Bess has a good point, Constance," she intervened. "Communication is very important, and I think you will find the language spoken by ordinary people is far richer in both the subtlety and variety of its words than so-called standard English." Young Daniel, being oblivious to this discussion and unaware that Constance was watching his every move, linked his friend's arm. "Find us a table, Em. I need to talk to thee for a minute. I'm needing advice, and thee art the one to provide it." Emma nodded and went to do as bid. Chapter 2. Whilst Irene Rose sat outside Mary's kitchen with Daniel Senior, Faith, Benjamin, Constance and her husband, Matthew Etherow had found himself a place at the kitchen table in Mary Upton's cottage, and was in conversation with Giuseppe Peduzzi and Mary, having been served tea by Anna Sutcliffe, who, as usual, had made a fuss of him. Now 26, Giuseppe had married his sweetheart, Amy Radbourne, and was the proud father of a 2-year-old lad, Giorgio, who sat on his knee. The Italian had grown into a handsome young man. He no longer earned his living by playing the hurdy-gurdy, although he occasionally entertained patrons of Mary's kitchen with the instrument. He developed his singing voice, and found himself in great demand. The Italian tenor had no shortage of employment, both on stage and as a teacher. Many changes had taken place since the formation of the cooperative enterprise back in 1838. The co-op members had weathered the storm of the industrial unrest of 1842, and even though they cut prices to the bone during the period of the general strike, they still managed to pay a healthy dividend at the end of that year, both to themselves and to their regular customers. Additionally, the assistance and hospitality they provided the strikers, particularly those from other areas of Manchester and outside the town itself, had not been forgotten, and those who travelled into the town centre often drifted to Mary's kitchen for sustenance and a chat about old times. Mary Upton had officially retired, and Amy had been elected by the co-op members to be their new manager, head cook and bottle washer, with Anna Sutcliffe as her deputy. Nonetheless, Mary remained at hand to give advice and assistance whenever needed, and still played a major role in the organisation of the nursery. This now catered for over 20 mill workers' children during working hours. Within 5 years of the general strike, and as a direct result of it, the provisions of the 10 Hours Bill became law with regard to women and children employed in the cotton industry. The practice of recruiting pauper children as unpaid indentured labour in the textile mills was also ended in 1847, although it would take another 20 years before the Factory Acts were applied to all manufacturing industries. However, the 9 years since 1842 had not been without their difficulties. The great hunger in Ireland and the flight of those who had the strength and means to flee from destitution, starvation, disease and death had not helped, and the resultant problems, not least for Manchester, faced with a further increase in population, hadn't peaked until well after 1846. Over 1 million Irish died because of Queen Victoria's government's failure to ensure just a little of the food available in plenty was made available to the Irish poor. Another 2.5 million migrated to the United States, Canada, Australia and Britain. Yet throughout the period of what the British insisted on calling the famine, wheat, barley and oats, along with beef and dairy cattle, pigs and mutton, continued to be exported from Ireland to England in great quantities. The manufacturers had of course welcomed a new influx of Irish migrants desperate for work as a cheap source of labour and to boost the reserve army of the unemployed, as they would welcome anybody and anything that undermined wage levels. Indeed, in June 1844, the Times of London, not particularly noted as a tribune of the people, felt the economic distress amongst both the agricultural and industrial labourers in England sufficiently dire to issue the following warning. War to the mansion, peace to the cottage, is a watchword of terror which may yet ring through the land. Let the wealthy beware. Social conditions had not really improved since then. The housing situation in Manchester and Salford had certainly not changed, except to deteriorate through willful neglect. Typhus, cholera, scarlet fever and tuberculosis continued to inflict death on the labouring poor year after year. The rivers which served as both towns' principal sewers were still the main source of drinking water. Employers generally had learnt to show a little more respect to their workforce and had been slightly less prone to rush into imposing wage cuts, although they still neglected their welfare. Industrial accidents, if anything, were growing in number as machine speeds increased. Even the use of wage cuts had not disappeared and remained an important weapon in the manufacturer's arsenal. True, the workers were slowly developing their defences as they strengthened their trade union organisations, but still had a long way to go before they could be truly effective and not just weak defensive mechanisms reacting to events initiated by the employers. At long last, in January 1846, Sir Robert Peel had made a move to fulfil Cobden and Bright's wishes. He announced in a 3-hour speech to the House of Commons that the Corn Laws would be abolished on the 1st of February 1849, and over the intervening 3 years, a series of reductions to the import tariff would take place, thus allowing cheap supplies of this staple food to be imported. Lord Stanley immediately resigned from the cabinet, and Lord George Bentinck and Benjamin Disraeli led the opposition to repeal, arguing it would socially and politically weaken the traditional landowning aristocracy and destroy the territorial constitution of Britain by empowering commercial interests, by which they meant the manufacturing middle classes. Despite their opposition, the Commons approved the third reading of Peel's bill for repeal of the Corn Laws by 327 votes to 229. Nonetheless, a majority of Peel's party voted against. On the 25th of June, the House of Lords voted in favour. Unfortunately for the Prime Minister, on that same night, a combination of Whigs, Radicals and Tory protectionists defeated Peel's Irish Coercion Bill in the Commons, the Tories intent on revenge for their leader's insistence on repeal of the Corn Laws and the betrayal of their interests. Consequently, knowing he didn't have the support of his own party, Peel did the honourable thing and resigned. With the Tory party split, Queen Victoria invited the Whigs under Lord Russell to form a government. However, by the end of December, Russell announced he'd been unable to do so, and Peel became Prime Minister again, with a government supported by a fluctuating combination of what were to become known as Peelite Tories, including William Gladstone and the Earl of Aberdeen, and free trade supporting Radicals and Whigs. Russell finally replaced Peel as Prime Minister in 1847. Since 1846, as Michael O'Donnell had so accurately predicted over a decade before to his friend John Doughty, as the price of corn went down, the pressure to reduce wages increased. The need to develop and strengthen workers' organisation became increasingly apparent and ever more pressing, a fact underlined by Parliament's out-of-hand rejection of the Third Great Petition for the People's Charter in March 1848. This contained over 4.5 million signatures, some 5 times the British electorate's total number. Now, in 1851, Matthew had received a letter from David Morrison, who, following his release from prison, had found himself blacklisted due to his role in organising the 1842 strike. Having been refused employment at his old place of work, he'd moved to Swindon in 1843 with his family, where he'd found employment as an engineer with the Great Western Railway at their locomotive works in the town. In the intervening period, he kept in touch with those who'd supported his wife and family during difficult times. His letter related how he, along with other trade unionists, had helped found the Amalgamated Society of Engineers through the merger of a number of specialist craft unions earlier that year. The ASE was one of the first unions bringing together the rapidly growing number of skilled engineering workers on a national basis in a bid to meet the needs of the modern era, overcome sectional differences, and to replace fragmented locally based organisations, the first of what were to become known as the New Model Unions. It was a piece of correspondence full of hope for the future. David reported his employer had put his talents to good use. Promoted to the company's research and development department, he headed a team of highly skilled workers. His wife Janet flourished with their growing family living in a healthy, semi-rural environment, far different from that of polluted Manchester. He'd asked Matthew to have a word with Daniel before he started his employment. The ASE had members at Mathers, and David felt Daniel should join the union at the earliest opportunity. Matthew had discussed the matter with his son-in-law, and they'd agreed to speak to the lad jointly. The problem now exercising the mill owner's mind was to find the opportunity. Daniel was a popular young man, especially with the girls. Maybe the question of trade unionism and his future in the engineering industry could wait, not least because it was the last day of his childhood. Irene Rose's concerns were different. She took it for granted the lad would play a positive and perhaps even a leading role in the struggles facing his class, both in the field of trade unionism and the campaign for democracy. Daniel was his mother's son, and she felt sure he'd follow in his mother's footsteps. Because of his mother's death and the relationship that had existed between Bess Akroyd and herself, Daniel's subsequent upbringing had been rather unique, providing him with an intimate knowledge of 2 very different worlds, and he'd been subjected to the influence of 2 quite different environments. Despite his employment as her father's deputy building superintendent, and his subsequent promotion to superintendent, Daniel's father still lived in their old home in Ancoats, although he'd undertaken much-needed improvements to the property. He couldn't bear to leave the house where he and Bess had been so happy, and where his son had been born. Inevitably, young Daniel's principal friends were the children of the mill workers, who'd been his mother's friends and colleagues, and he'd never been shielded from the social and working conditions endured by the labouring poor. Their world, with all its deprivations and challenges, was very much his world, and would continue to be so as he embarked on his own role as a working man. At the same time, Daniel's close relationship with Irene Rose had provided him with a good basic education and first-hand knowledge of a world of luxury and privilege few of his fellows would experience. The lad was bright and articulate. He possessed an enquiring mind. He loved to read, and there was no shortage of literature in the Etherose library he could access. Over the last 2 years, Irene Rose had introduced him to the Mechanics' Institute, and he often spent hours in this seat of learning, devouring information and knowledge voraciously. Increasingly, he questioned why the glaring and all too obviously unfair disparities between the social classes existed, why those with power in society, not least the representatives of organised religion, didn't intervene to ameliorate them, and in particular why workers continued to endure them. This led to many interesting debates, and Irene Rose ensured the lad had contact with some of the key leading working-class activists and intellectuals, particularly John Doherty, James Leach and their friends,
as well as some of the more radical thinkers from the middle class who could provide him with answers. She'd taken great care not to force her own ideas upon him, but rather had exposed him to situations and the realities of life which would provoke and stimulate his own thought processes. This learning process had of course not been one way. It had influenced Irene Rose too. It helped clarify her ideas about her position in society as a member of the middle class and as a woman, and continued to do so. It stimulated her imagination. It conjured ideas of a future devoid of class differences, prejudices and conflict, and how such a future might be attained. No longer a mere Chartist, she considered herself a committed socialist. The issues exercising the mill owner's daughter's mind regarding Daniel at this precise moment were much more immediate, namely his relationship with Constance. The girl was going through a difficult stage in her life, a stage that Irene Rose was still young enough to remember. The lass remained vulnerable. Her adopted daughter had feelings towards Daniel that he may not reciprocate. The last thing Irene Rose wanted was for Constance to be hurt, or see the underlying friendship between the two youngsters damaged. She wondered how she could help, or if it was better to leave well alone and simply let events take their natural course. She looked over to the table across the yard. Emma Chadwick had grown into a beautiful young woman. Like her mother, she worked at Gibraltar Mill, where she was highly thought of. She and Daniel looked a handsome couple, and obviously enjoyed each other's company. Irene Rose watched as Emma placed her hand on top of Daniel's and gave it an affectionate squeeze. Now she was rising from her seat, smiling, and looking as pleased as Punch. She leant over towards him and ruffled his hair briefly. She laughed and said something to him, shaking the locks of her own thick dark hair as she adjusted the shawl on her shoulders. Now she was walking away, a smile remaining on her countenance. The look on Daniel's face struck Irene Rose forcibly. It was a portrait of happiness. She wondered what the two had been discussing. They seemed to have reached a mutually acceptable conclusion, whatever it was. She looked across the table to where her daughter sat. Constance also had her eye on the unfolding events. She was glaring daggers. At that precise moment Daniel stood up, straightened his tie, and began to walk towards them. Constance immediately looked away, her attention seemingly suddenly captured by the intricate shape of a knot in the old deal tabletop, which she began to trace with an outstretched, rather elegant and neatly manicured finger. "Would you like tea, Daniel?" Irene Rose asked. The lad shook his head and stood gazing down at the top of Constance's bonnet for a moment, a serious look on his face. He lifted his hand to straighten the already much straightened tie, and swallowed. "Connie, would you like to take a walk along the canal with me?" he asked. "I'd regard it as a great favour." Little Faith put her arm around young Bessie's shoulder, and the girls' heads came together as they both giggled conspiratorially. Benjamin glanced up at his father, wondering why his younger sisters were so amused, and why his mother looked so happy. Michael shrugged his shoulders in return, although he too had an expansive smile on his face. Benjamin felt he'd missed something important. "So what did Daniel have to say to you?" On hearing their mother's question, Bess and Faith looked up expectantly from their place on the Indian rug, suddenly losing all interest in the dolls they were playing with. Constance had been in a dreamlike state ever since they'd returned home to the house in Hardwick, remaining unusually silent. "Mother, he might hear you." Irene Rose smiled encouragingly. "He's in the garden with your father. Don't be shy, Constance. Tell all. You're amongst friends." Constance looked down at her hands folded in her lap, as if deep in thought, concentrating as she tried to decide whether to divulge what had taken place between Daniel and herself. Eventually she made up her mind. "He told me I made him as happy as a pig with a bucket of porridge," she replied quietly. Faith looked at Bess, and Bess looked at Faith. Next minute they were in each other's arms, breaking down into fits of uncontrollable giggles and laughter. "Now, children, that's quite enough merriment. Affairs of the heart are a serious business," Irene Rose admonished, although it must be said she was barely able to contain her own amusement. "Daniel ne'er said that," Bess responded. "He'd have said, Tha makes me as happy as a pig wi' its head in pail of porridge. It's one of his favourite sayings." She looked at her older sibling. "He's always saying it to me," she added with a note of triumph, swiftly adding, rather defiantly, "Anyway, I told you Broad Lancashire was the language of the poets." Constance's mouth opened, but fortunately for Bess perhaps, so did the library door, as Michael, Matthew and young Daniel entered the room. Grace the maid followed on close behind. "Would you like me to serve the tea now, Miss Rose?" she asked. Constance positively shot out of her seat. "I'll help you, Grace," she exclaimed. "The tray will be far too heavy for you." Again little Faith looked at Bess, a grin spreading over her mischievous face. Bess laughed in her turn before saying, "Helping the maid, how common, and she's from such a good family." "I don't think it's a good idea to join the union." Michael O'Donnell looked at Bess Akroyd's son in disbelief. Constance sat quietly, all ears. This reaction was one that nobody could have expected. Matthew gathered his wits first. "And why do you think that, young man?" "I think I'm quite capable of making my own way in the world. I believe in individual liberty. I intend to work hard, and all I expect in return is to be treated decently and be paid commensurate with my work." Michael looked around at Irene Rose, seeking her support, but she seemed oblivious to the conversation, concentrating on her embroidery. Constance positively beamed approval. "In an ideal world that would be fine," Michael responded, "but we don't live in an ideal world. From what I've been told by my father, by you and Mr. Etherow, William Mather's a fair man and a reasonable employer." Matthew frowned, shaking his head of long white hair. The mill owner wasn't used to being called Mr. by young Daniel. It was normally either uncle or, if the lad was being formal, great-uncle. "Daniel," he replied rather sternly, "I regard myself as a good employer, but that doesn't mean my workers don't need a union. The fact is they do, and I believe it's in my interests that they are. How on earth can I be expected to deal with 450-odd workers individually and pay due attention to their grievances?" He shook his head. "I don't know what your dear mother would say if she could hear you now." "My mother can't say a thing because she was a union member and a Chartist. That's why she was murdered. That's why Nathaniel West ran her down like a dog in the street," Daniel responded. Constance looked stunned, this being extremely shocking news to Daniel's admirer. "Yes, you're quite right, Daniel," Michael O'Donnell interjected, trying hard to keep his own voice soft. "That's precisely why your mother died and why you should continue her work in honour of her memory, as we all try to do. Your mother wanted to provide a better future for you, just as most working people want to provide a better future for their children. But she knew the only sure way she could achieve that was in combination with her fellows. As individual workers we're weak and powerless. Together we're strong. We can only guarantee the betterment of our own individual conditions through the betterment of all." "With respect, Michael, I'm not stupid," Daniel responded, shaking his head. "I have confidence I can deal with any man on a one-to-one basis. I'm quite capable of negotiating with my employer. I will give a fair day's work, and in return I will ask for a fair day's pay. It's as simple as that. I intend to work hard, to study at the Mechanics' Institute during the evenings, make my way in the world by my own efforts, and become a manager eventually." "There's nothing fair about employment," the mill owner interjected with a wry smile. "The only fair thing in the world we live in is the weather, and that's not guaranteed, not by any means." Daniel looked at him quizzically. Matthew returned his gaze, locking on to the lad's dark brown eyes. "When you deal with somebody like me, or William Mather for that matter, young man, you're dealing first and foremost with a businessman, a hard-nosed, hard-headed merchant, somebody expert in two things above all else, buying and selling." He pushed back slightly, tilting his chair, determined to make his point. "I buy cheap as possible, and I sell dear as the market will stand. That's the secret of successful business. That's how one makes a profit in our wonderful laissez-faire capitalist system." "Yes, sir, I understand that. Do you really, young man? Matthew shook his head. I don't think you do, because if you did truly understand, you wouldn't think twice about becoming a member of the union. Michael O'Donnell smiled as the mill owner began to acquaint the lad with the facts of economic life. You see, Daniel, the mill owner continued, in the case of master and men, the master is the buyer, and you, as one of the men, are the seller. You've only one thing to sell that's of interest to me, and that's your labour power. I have everything else I require, the mill, the machinery, the product, and the customers. I don't even need men. All I need is a few hundred hands to operate my machinery, and I can flood the market with my cotton yarn and make my fortune. But to do that, I need to purchase hands. I need labour power. Without it, my mill and my machines can't produce anything. So here we are. I want to buy your labour power. And I want to sell my labour power. Excellent. We have something in common at least. However, I want to buy your labour power for as little as possible. I have to compete with other manufacturers, and they continually try to undercut me. I have to keep overheads down, and wages are simply an additional overhead to me. He looked the lad in the eye. I'll make you an offer. I'll provide you with just enough wages to buy food to keep you going and nothing else. You provide your clothes, your drink, your own shelter, and everything else you require. That's not fair, the lad responded. How am I going to provide those things without a fair day's wage? Like I said, there's no such thing as fair when it comes to the relationship between master and men. You could get another job. I only require your labour power 12 hours a day for 6 days a week. That leaves you another 12 hours a day and a whole Sunday to earn sufficient for clothes, shelter, and any other small luxuries you might require. The lad shook his head in disbelief and disgust. I'm sorry, Daniel Akroyd, you're not my slave. If you were, I'd have to maintain you. But you're a free man. That's the beauty of laissez-faire capitalism. As Adam Smith so succinctly pointed out, labourers are free men and cost less than slaves to maintain. That's why capitalism's extremely efficient. When operatives aren't needed, we discharge them. You have individual liberty. You're a free man. How you manage is none of my business. I'm a buyer, and I buy as cheap as possible, as I told you at the outset of this negotiation, and I sell as dear as I can. That's all there is to it, and the sooner you face up to reality, the better. Well, Daniel responded, I'm like you, Mr. Matthew Ethrow, and I play by the same rules. I sell as dear as I can as well, and what you're offering is just not good enough. I'll only work 10 hours a day. I need time for sleep and time for leisure and education. Moreover, I point out, without labour power, your machinery is worthless. I need enough wages to at least feed, clothe, and house myself, and I want extra for my own recreation and to maintain my dependents. I'm not only a free man, but your equal. Unless you agree to treat me decent, I'll take my labour power elsewhere. Well, Mr. Daniel Akroyd, Matthew grinned, you put a good case, and a very dangerous one from my point of view. If all my workers had such ideas, I'd be in trouble, wouldn't I? You sound like a socialist agitator to me, a potential demagogue, a troublemaker. I suggest you go off and play, and I suggest you do it now, because for every worker that wants to sell his labour power dear, there's 100 more so desperate for work they'll sell it cheap. He laughed an evil-sounding laugh. Go out in the street now, Daniel, see for yourself just how many men are clemming for the lack of work. And furthermore, if you are my equal, why do I enjoy the vote, whilst you never will? I have power, economic and political. You have nothing except your labour power. You're a mere wage slave, a pair of hands, nothing more. You need to face up to that reality. Be off with you. A bit of starvation might put you in a better frame of mind. He placed his hand on top of young Daniel's. That's why I'm worth a fortune, and why you need to be a member of a trade union. The only way you can ensure you're able to sell your labour power at anywhere near a fair price is to eliminate the competition between you and your fellows. That competition enables me and all manufacturers like me to undercut wages." He grinned at the lad. "Its elimination can only be achieved by all workers combining and acting together. There's simply no other way within the present economic system. If you can find one, you'll make your fortune." "All right, I think that's just about enough for one day, young Daniel Akroyd." The three males turned, surprised by Irene Rose's intervention. She smiled, putting her embroidery down and standing. "Right, you mischievous little devil, show them my birthday present." Daniel grinned at Irene Rose, slid his hand into the inside pocket of his new Sunday jacket and pulled out a calfskin wallet. He opened it, a grave look appearing on his young face once more, and passed it over to Michael. The trade union official's visage broke into a broad smile, and he passed it on to the mill owner. The wallet was Rose's present. Devoid of money, it only contained a green card, an Amalgamated Society of Engineers membership card. "Daniel asked me to take him into town on Friday to meet the Manchester Secretary of the Union," Irene Rose explained, walking towards them. "Come with me, Daniel. There's something else I have for you." She put her arm around his shoulder and took him over to a glass-fronted bookcase situated to the right of the fireplace, opened the doors, reached inside, and passed him a small leather-bound book. "This is a present I gave to your mother on her last birthday. She had it in her hand when she was killed. I promised your father I'd keep it for you until you were old enough to understand." Daniel looked at the book in wonder and opened it. He read the inscription in blue ink and a neat hand which said, "To my dearest Bess, the Manchester Chartist, on your 19th birthday. From a loving sister, to whom you have been an amazing source of enlightenment and an inspiration to action. All my love, your friend and comrade in arms, always, Rose Etherow." Daniel flipped through the pages and found what he was seeking, the Mask of Anarchy. His father knew it off by heart. "What art thou, freedom?" Irene Rose asked. Daniel found the verses his father seemed to love the most. "Thou art not, as impostors say, a shadow soon to pass away, a superstition and a name, echoing from the eaves of fame. For the labourer thou art bread, and a comely table spread, from his daily labour come in a neat and happy home. Thou art clothes and fire and food for the trampled multitude. No, in countries that are free, such starvation cannot be, as in England now we see." He turned to the woman who played such a wonderful and important influence in his development, and took her in his arms. "Thank you, Aunt Rose. You've always been my rock. I won't let you or my mother down. I promise." Rose smiled and kissed him on the forehead. "I never doubted you for one moment, my lovely Daniel. I once told your mother that she and I would change the world. Bess is no longer with us, but you are, and the world still needs changing. The place to start is your new place of work. Once you have your feet firmly under the table, that is. Learn your trade, prove you're a good workman, be practical, and take one step at a time. Don't give your employer an excuse to sack you. That's the first lesson for any would-be revolutionary. And without revolutionaries, we can't change the world." Constance O'Donnell, having listened carefully to the whole conversation, looked on in wonder. Her own simplistic and little thought-out ideas about the world she inhabited subjected to a rather decisive shock. Nobody had troubled to explain to her how some achieved riches whilst others starved, and, to be fair, she'd never asked. An unpleasant and unwanted memory of a dank, dark cellar long forgotten, a cellar that had once been her home, had forced its way into her mind, a mind that had shut out such unpleasant thoughts and pushed them deep into the realm of her subconscious many years before. She now remembered she hadn't always lived in this house with its maid and cook and coachman, its good food and fine bed linen. She'd once had another father and mother who had loved and cared for her, as they'd loved and cared for Faith and Benjamin, just as Irene Rose and Michael did now. She found herself needing to talk about them. She needed to find out why they'd been taken away from her and her brother and sister. She walked over to the man she'd called father for so many years, trying her best to stop the tears welling up in her eyes, but not succeeding. Michael O'Donnell saw them immediately, and opened his arms to her. "What is it, cushla mine?" he asked softly as she buried her face against his chest, sobbing her heart out, although he instinctively knew the answer to his own question. He'd anticipated this moment for a long time, knowing that sooner or later the girl would feel the need to know her own history. He'd start by explaining how her father, Jimmy Andrews, had first taken him into his own home and provided him with much-needed sustenance and shelter. On that fateful day, when he and John Doherty had first arrived in Manchester, they were both bereft of jobs or money, Michael having one sixpenny piece sewn into his jacket pocket for emergencies, and John down to his last twopence. Without the aid Jimmy Andrews had so freely provided, the first few days in Manchester would no doubt have proved disastrous for the two rather naive young Irishmen. He took the youngster in his arms, patiently waiting for her tears to subside.
Chapter 3. William Mather was in a good mood. He'd travelled back from London the day before, having spent most of the previous week visiting the Great Exhibition, where his company had textile finishing machinery on display. His older brother Colin, a cabinet maker who'd reinvented himself as a machine maker, had initiated the firm back in 1827. William had joined in 1836 as his brother's partner, and they'd moved to premises in Brown Street, Salford, convenient to the River Irwell and to Manchester. From here they'd expanded into larger premises opposite, on the other side of Chapel Street, leasing the already established Salford Ironworks from John Platt in 1845, although they continued to use the Brown Street premises. Manufacturers of textile finishing machinery, they had an 8-colour calico printing machine, drying apparatus, a sewing machine they'd invented in 1847 for the batch production of calico pieces, and patent precision-engineered cylinders for steam mill engines on display in London. Colin, who no longer played an active role in the business due to an industrial accident, had been dubious about participating in the Great Exhibition, but William had insisted they do so, not least because his own son, who despite his youth had tremendous enthusiasm for everything mechanical, had persuaded him the company had little to lose and everything to gain. Young William was nae but a lad, as his father was fond of pointing out, but had no lack of foresight and enterprise, qualities enhanced by the zeal of youth. He was still only 13, having started his apprenticeship working on the shop floor at his own insistence, and with his uncle Colin's enthusiastic support the year before. In persuading his father to exhibit their wares, he'd helped ensure the company's future success, for the next few years at least. The Great Exhibition had opened in London in May that year, and would finish at the end of October. The Mathers order book was bulging as a result of their participation, not least with export orders. William looked up from the catalogue he was perusing in answer to a knock on his office door. His works manager entered the room, accompanied by a young dark-haired lad. The factory owner stood up and beamed a smile at his young visitor. "Daniel Akroyd, I presume? Matthew Etherall's young protege. Come in, lad, pull up a chair." The works manager turned to leave. "Nay, sit down, Ben. You can take lad to the machine shop when I've finished with him." He turned his attention back to Daniel, remaining on his feet and towering above the youngster. Daniel felt rather uncomfortable, forced to look up at the older man, which of course was William's intention. "So how are you, young man? Are they looking forward to starting work?" "Yes, I am, sir, very much so." William looked at the lad shrewdly, a little taken aback by his clear English pronunciation, only slightly tinged with a south-east Lancashire accent. He'd expected a working-class youth speaking the local dialect. This lad seemed somewhat special. "I understand from Matthew Etherall thy mother was a cotton spinner and thy father's a carpenter." "Yes, that's right, Mr. Mather." "Can you read and write, lad?" "Yes, sir, and I'm studying physics, geometry, algebra and trigonometry, and I'm trying to learn Latin and Greek." "Why would they want to learn Latin and Greek?" "I've been told if I have a basic understanding of them, it makes it much easier to learn most European languages. And increasingly our trade is with Europe, isn't it, sir?"
William was impressed, to say the least. Matthew had told him the lad was bright and intelligent, but hadn't revealed the true extent of his education. "I say, young man, I think I'm going to have a rethink about work I was going to put you to. Are they willing to study in your own time? Are they willing to attend Mechanics' Institute on Cooper Street?" "Yes, sir." "Do they know where Cooper Street is?" "Yes, sir, it's off Princess Street. I study there some evenings." "Good lad." He turned to Ben Crowther. "Take lad to see our William. Tell him I want him to teach Daniel everything he knows and to enrol him at the Institute on the same course of studies he's on. Introduce him to Bill Holland first, and explain to Bill how I want Daniel to work with William on his special projects." Ben nodded, more than a little surprised. The lad had obviously made an impression. They originally intended to put him to work in the machine shop on a lathe, churning out nuts and bolts and other machine parts in quantity, so as to commence producing a profit for the firm at the earliest opportunity. William turned to Daniel. "Work hard and study hard, young man. I've a feeling you're going places." He stuck his hand out. Daniel stood up and shook it. "Thank you, sir," he responded. From his brief experience up to now, he was more than impressed by his new employer. William Mather's personality seemed every bit in line with Matthew Etherow's description. "Right, off they go, and when you see our William, ask him to come and see me at lunch hour, will you please?" With that, the interview was over. Ben Crowther guided a rather bemused Daniel out of the office. William Mather watched them go, smiled to himself, and returned to the catalogue. He needed to keep up to date and discover what his competitors were up to. Textile machine manufacturers were bloody cutthroats.